please tell me your full name and when and where you were born.
Kenneth Earl Sergent. I was born November 13th, 1941, Wallins Creek, Kentucky.
Do you have any family members that are serving or have served in the military?
I have one younger brother. He's 4 years younger than I. Had served during the Vietnam War, and he served in Thailand and was in the Air Force.
What were you doing before you entered the service?
I was in school. I went to school and decided to drop out of school and go into the military. I was 17 years old, so I changed my career from going to school to becoming a soldier in the Army.
Why did you choose to be in the Army, that specific branch?
I always wanted to be in the Army. Even when I was younger, I was always playing soldier and reading about the Army, studying up on the Army. I knew more about the Army than I did anything else. And I always wanted to be in the infantry, and that was just one of my goals, so that's what I decided I wanted to do. My mother didn't want me to go because I was too young and she was afraid I would get killed, so she wouldn't sign the papers, but I told my dad that that's where I wanted to be, and he told me he would help me, so he knew a colonel that was in the Army, and he spoke with the colonel, and he came back and told me, he says, the colonel will help you get into the Army. So the colonel, knowing all about the Army, decided that he would give me a leg up. So he gave me the information, told me what I needed to do, and I did it. And my dad, knowing that there was no war going on and knowing that I would be drafted anyhow when I got 18, decided that since that's what I wanted, it would be a good idea for my mom to sign the papers. So she signed the papers so I could go into the military.
What happened when you departed for boot camp and during early days of training?
For me, that was sort of a difficult time because I'd never been away from my family before and I'd never been away from home. But they told me what I needed to do and gave me the information, and I knew where I was going, what I was going to do, but it was kind of scary in a way, but in another way I was so excited about it that it didn't really bother me all that much. But when I walked into the post office and they gave me all the information, they told me I would be going on a Greyhound bus, and they gave me the tickets, and they gave me the tickets for the hotel, and they gave me the tickets for the food. And so I got on the bus and we left, and it was so excited about where I was going that I didn't think too much about where I had been. I was kind of awestruck, I suppose is the word, and excited. But once I got in the hotel, which I'd never been in a hotel before, and of course I didn't eat in restaurants in those days either, but there was the restaurant and the meals and everything was pretty much taken care of. But I spent the entire day in an induction center where you were with a lot of other people. They were going into the Army too, so I figured if they can do it, I can do it. And I went ahead and just kind of followed the crowd, and everything went well.
Do you have any memories of your instructors that you would like to share?
Well, there's some of them that were pretty rough because when I went into the Army, the instructors were mean. I mean, just plain downright mean. And what I mean by that is that they got real loud and did a lot of name calling. And I don't recall ever getting slapped around because I don't think they could hit you at that time, but I'm sure many of them wanted to because they were probably used to fellows like me that had a chip on both shoulders and was a little bit mouthy maybe. But some of them, I even had one trying to tell me how to pronounce my last name because my last name being different than what they were used to. They said, "You don't know how to pronounce your own name." And I said, "Well, I've never been called anything but my name, and so if you change it, that's okay by me. Whatever you want to call me is all right. I'll answer to anything." But I don't recall too many of them's last names, even though they were all there. But there were several incidents that I do remember that most people wouldn't remember unless they're as old as I am. One of the problems I had when I went in was the fact that we had the Afro-Americans back then, and we were having the racial riots. And at that time, I had never seen a person that was any different than I am. So when I went into the military, we had two people there, and we stopped in a restaurant, and we had something to eat, which was a steak dinner, the best meal I probably ever ate in my life. It was real late at night, and I wanted to know where these two fellows were, and they said, they're not allowed to eat where you are. I said, well, if they're not allowed to eat where I am, then maybe I should be allowed to eat where they are. And they said, no, you can't eat there either. So I had to accept that. And of course, as my military went on, I found out why. Because in those days, there was a lot of restraint and a lot of things going on that most people now probably wouldn't understand, but I didn't understand it either because, like I said, I'd never seen any person of any other color than myself, other than what was on TV, which in those days, there wasn't that much on TV.
Did you receive any specialized training? If so, what kind?
Well, actually, the training that I received when I went started out, I was told where I would be going and what I would be doing, but that changed because I didn't go to where I thought I was going to go, and I went to a different place, and where I was going was going to basic training. When I went to basic training, we flew from where I was to Fort Riley, Kansas. We landed in Topeka, Kansas, and I had all the orders for 65 people. There were 65 of us, and I was in charge. And I had all the orders, and we reported to Fort Riley, Kansas, and I gave the first sergeant all the orders, and I would stay there for 6 months. I had 8 weeks of basic training, 8 weeks of advanced individual training, and then I had 8 weeks of combat training. So after my 6 months was up, they gave me a 3-day pass, and I was off for 3 days, and then I was transferred to another unit. During this time at the other unit, when I transferred, I went from 6 months of that training into the Rangers and spent 6 months in Ranger training, where I became a Ranger. And after I completed that, then I was given my orders to go to Korea and sent home. When I went home for the leave, it was cold, it was winter, we had 3 foot of snow, and the orders were sent, and they arrived at the post office. I didn't get them, but my mom got them. She gave them to me, and I had to report to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And I went to Fort Dix, and I was late. The ship had already sailed without me, and they had told me that I was going to be shipped to Fort Lewis, Washington to go to Korea, but my orders were changed, and I was shipped to Germany instead, and I had to wait at Fort Dix until time to go overseas. I waited there for almost a month until the ship got there, and then I went on the ship and went to Germany. And there I spent over 2 years. And while I was in Germany, I was waiting to get out of the Army, but then they said Vietnam had broken out, and I was to be transferred to Vietnam. But what happened was I was extended for a year due to the building of the Berlin Wall, and I had to stay until the wall was complete or until the replacements arrived. So one day the sergeant came over and he says, "You're going to be discharged today." And I was so surprised I didn't know what to say. So he said, "No, you're out of the Army today." So that day I was taken by train to Bremerhaven, Germany, and we had a colonel there. She was a lady colonel, an elderly lady. And she said, "Don't worry, Sergeant, we haven't had anybody swimming yet." But I was out of the Army that day. And I guess one of the happiest days of my life, of course, we had to get back to New York, and seeing that Statue of Liberty was one of the happiest days. But getting back home with my family and my mom and all the people, they didn't know I was coming. And I just sort of showed up. And my dad was in the yard, and I got out of a taxi. And he said, "Son, don't go inside. It'll kill your mother. She'll have a heart attack for sure." And he left me outside while he went and told my mom that I was home. And that was probably the happiest day of my life.
Where did you spend most of your time serving?
I was all over Germany most of the time. We were on maneuvers most of the time, and what time I was there, we were either guarding the border, because in those days the border was a communist border. Of course, they had a 50-yard plowed strip between us and the communists on the other side. So I spent most of my time either guarding that border or training for maneuvers. So most of the time was spent in the field. We stayed outside most of the time, and most of the time we were traveling from one place to the other, starting in probably in one side of Germany, and you may start today be in one part of Germany, and tomorrow you may be 200 miles away, because we did so much moving around. So we just moved all the time, moving from one place to the other, and different assignments, different posts. I was probably on at least 10 to 15 different posts during the 2 years that I was in Germany, everywhere from Grafenwehr, Weilflecken, Amberg, Nuremberg. I was stationed in Schaffenburg. I even spent some time well, actually, I was stationed pretty close to Gelnhausen, Hanau, and around, most of the time it was in Frankfurt. With some of those cities around those areas, like I said, we would start maybe be close to one city one day, and you may be 200 miles away the next, because we were always maneuvering, going from various places and going through different exercises. During the time I was in Germany, probably went through at least 5 exercises, and most of them were anywhere from 2 to 3 to 5 months long. And a lot of times you would spend 3 to 4 months in the field, you'd never see a building, you'd always outside. And it was always cold.
Would you tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences overseas?
Well, I don't remember too much about the exciting good times over there as much as I do some of the bad times. And looking back on them, maybe they weren't so bad, but they were pretty bad at the time. The good memories was the fact that even though they seemed to be real bad at the time, as it turned out, at least I got out alive. There were some times that one would wonder if he was going to, or wonder how he managed to get out without casualties, because we had a lot of those when I went in the Army and when I was in Germany. Times were a lot different then. As a matter of fact, most of the folks, and like I say, I went out when I was 17. The draft would start at 18, and most of the people I was in the military with were drafted. And many of them didn't last very long, because a lot of them couldn't handle it. We had fellows that committed suicide, would dive off of buildings and find other ways to kill themselves, and some of them just failure to adjust, just couldn't handle it. Even when I was in Germany, we lost people all the time because of they were getting out on dishonorable discharges, Section 8s, any way to avoid, because it was a time when a lot of them didn't want to be where they were. And I think back along some of the things that happened. I can tell you some stories about basic training, for example. We were at Fort Riley, Kansas, basic training. We had a forced field march 20 miles. We didn't have any water. We were all wet from sweating, and when we did get water, it was salted. We salted it, and of course that kept us from dehydrating, so we kept the water. And we got onto the hill and dug in, and the tanks showed up, and we were supporting tanks because I was infantry. And my section sergeant was, I don't know, maybe 15 yards from me, and we were there, and I heard the tanks coming, and I looked up, and the tank had run over the guy next to me. He came out of the back, and it killed him. And there was several times where we had accidents like that. But I can recall some of the things like the infiltration course, some of the courses we had what they called a mad minute, where we fired our weapons for 1 full minute, and it was in the middle of the night, about midnight, and some of our flares set out a fire, and the fire got so bad that we had to stop, because we burned off several acres of just acres and acres of nothing but sagebrush where it caught on fire. Probably one of the bigger fires I'd ever seen in my life. And some of the things that happened during the exercises that we had, some of them were dangerous, but we didn't lose a lot of people in basic from accidents like that. Most of the accidents that we had and some of the problems we had were self-inflicted. And even when I got into the Rangers, we had problems with sometimes an accident would happen, someone would fall and they might get killed or break their back or something along those lines. But it was just part of what we did, and being that young, I never paid a great deal of attention to what went on. But there was a time in Germany where we had gone all night on the trains, and I was in charge of an APC, and I had 12 guys with me that were in my squad. And while they unloaded the train and everyone was going where they were going, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I took a tanker bar to take the chalk blocks from underneath the PC so I could drive it off of the flat car. And this was a German train. So during the time, I split the chalk block and smashed my finger against the flat car with the tanker bar, and it smashed my finger really, really bad, and I had to go to the medics. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The medics were there. They bandaged my finger, and then a captain asked me if I could go with him to where he was going, because he knew my MOS and he knew what I could do, and he knew I was a demolitions expert. So he said, "You were in demolitions?" And yes, sir, that's what I do. So I went with him to use C3 and C4 TNT, and we were to blow down trees and blow rails into and that sort of thing. And I was there all day, and the next day I went back to my unit and found out that most of the unit wasn't there anymore. They had had the accident, and that's when I was told that, and that's when I was missing in action, because when they had the muster alert, they called my name and I wasn't there, but they had found the dog tags of a fellow that had a name, last name same as mine, and they found his dog tags instead of mine, and that's when they thought I had been killed. And I had several pictures of that and the funeral exercises and some of the things that went on there. But that was one of the times when I was in the right place at the right time and had missed out on what happened there. But my first sergeant was killed, and several of my friends were killed, and most of the people that I knew. There were 16 of them killed, 26 of them were wounded, and that was a tragedy that I remember mostly of what happened as far as being in Germany. But we had a lot of people that whenever we were on field exercises, they would get around the carbon monoxide gas on some of the vehicles, and they would just get so tired that they would lay down next to the engines to get warm, and they would be so tired that they'd go to sleep, and then they would die because they wouldn't wake up, because they would die from poison monoxide gases. So we had some of that going on during those times. And also, I can recall one time that since we were having the racial problems, that we lost 8 men on Saturday night because they had all been out drinking and carousing and doing what they do, what soldiers do when they get their time off. And when they came back to the barracks, some of the guys just took entrenching tools and beat them to death and killed 8 of them. But we had a lot of that going on during those times. Those were stressful times.
How did you stay in touch with family and friends back home?
I had family and friends back home, but I only stayed in touch with one. My mom was the only one I stayed in touch with. In those days, we didn't have any phones. Like I told you earlier, even when they wanted me to go to Fort Lewis to go to Korea, and I ended up in Fort Dix, there was no way to contact me except by letter. And I wrote my mom all the time and wrote to her and told her what was going on. And that was really the only person that I wrote while I was in there, other than one girl. I wrote one girl while I was there for 2 years, and she had mentioned that she would meet me when I got out. She was going to meet me when I got to New York. But, of course, since I was extended, I didn't get to New York, and I didn't get to meet her, so that kind of went away. But like I said, when I finally got a chance to go see my mother, and she didn't know I was coming, But I still have some of the newspaper clippings and at least one letter that I wrote to my mom that I actually wrote to her on November the 10th of 1961. The Cold War broke out on August the 16th, 1961, and that's when I was extended for 1 year. Of course, I was kind of fortunate I didn't have to pull that much time. I got out instead. But when I got out, I was 20 years old, and I had missed the draft. And what happened was is I had gotten a job after I got out, and then I got the letter from the draft board that said I'd been drafted. And of course, I showed them my DD 14 and proved that I was still in, stationed at Indiantown Gap at that time. And the first thing they asked me was, where were you when you were 18? You're supposed to sign up for the draft. And I says, I think I was on the communist border in Germany when I was 18. So I couldn't be very well signed up for the draft. I was already in.
How did you return home?
Well, actually, as I told you earlier, I came home by ship out of Bremerhaven, Germany, and it took probably almost a month to get from Germany back to the States because over 15 days was spent on the ship getting across the ocean. And I got to New York. I had a duffel bag, and that's all I had was the clothes was in the duffel bag and the uniform I had on. And we were taken to the fort to be mustered out. And we went into this building, and that's where I got my pay. They gave me all the pay for all the leave that I'd accumulated, plus the month's pay and all of the money that was coming to me. And when I walked out, I had the uniform on that was my issue, and that's all I had. And everything else was gone. And I got a hold of the major, who was the post commander, and we looked all over. My clothes were never found. And it really didn't matter to me because I didn't need them anyhow. And I just went to New York, which is where we were, and tried to figure out a way to get out of New York, which wasn't that easy because going underground and going to different places, all I wanted to do was find a bus home. And I finally got a bus and started home and rode that bus all the way till I got to almost home. And when I got almost home, I was probably within 30 miles, and I started walking. And I probably walked for maybe 10 or 15 miles. And by the time I'd walked about 15 miles, I decided that I would hitchhike. So I hitchhiked for a time. And a fellow gave me a ride. And I got within 12 miles of home to a taxi cab. And I stopped in and I asked the fellow if he would mind taking me home, and he said I'd be glad to. I got in the vehicle. He drove me home. Right up to the front door, I got out, and there was my dad out in the yard planting trees. And that's when I got home, and all I had was the uniform I had on, and there I was.
What was your career after the war?
I stayed there at the house for a time, and that was a happy time for me because I didn't have anything in the world to do and the rest of my life to do it, and I had money. And my brother had gotten a job, and he was coming home, and he knew I was home. So within the week, he arrived home, and he wanted me to go back to live with him. He had two friends, and they had jobs. And he said, one of the friends is moving on. He's getting married, and there's a place for you to live. So I went with my brother, and I stayed with him for a time. And we went from place to place until I found a job. And I walked in and told the fellow I needed a job, told him what I could do. He said he needed a man. And I said, I'm your man. And I went to work for Wonder Bread, working for the Continental Baking Company. And when I started out there, any job they gave me was fine with me because I could do anything. And I knew once I got there, I would move up. I worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, on anything they wanted me to do, and they kept moving me from one position to the other, and I stayed there for the better part of a couple of years, doing nothing but working in a bakery. And after the bakery, I moved on and changed locations, and my brother got his job. He moved on. He moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and became a police dispatcher. I moved to Ohio and got several jobs while I was up there, but my career that I actually ended up with was going to civil service and couldn't get in the Air Force because I didn't qualify, and I was turned down on a medical for the Air Force, but I was accepted in civil service, and I spent 20 years with them. And after that 20 years, I transferred and spent 15 years with the Department of Defense.
Have you remained in contact with or reunited with fellow veterans?
No, once I got out, I never heard from any veterans again. I remember some of the names of some of them, but as far as ever contacting any of them, I don't know whatever happened to any of them. Once I left Germany and got back, I never knew where any of them were from, didn't know any of them's names. I recall that while I was in Germany, on the post I was on, there were 2 people on that post from my home state. Only 2 people. And I knew the cities where they were because one of them was where I was from, and the other one was where I was inducted in the Army. And that's the only 2 people from the states that I even knew. I don't know what ever happened to them. I know when I got back, I contacted a friend of mine that I grew up with. He was younger than me, and he told me his brother was in the Army. He gave me his address. I found out later that his brother came into the unit I was in the exact same building, in the exact same outfit that I was in, and knew all the people that I knew when I left there. And some of the stories he told me from writing to his brother were similar to the stories I've been telling you, as far as some of the problems they had and some of the stories that he would tell, because he was a mechanic and he was working on a tank, and the fellow working on the tank got his arm cut off because they started the tank while he was working on it, and he lost 3 fingers. I contacted him after he got out, and he's the only one that I ever knew. But when the 2 of us were in school, in our one class, out of all the classmates, there were only 2 boys, me and him. And it's sort of ironic that we both ended up in the same outfit at 2 different times. Of course, he came in after I left, and I even saw him once after I moved to Ohio. We played on the same baseball team.
What are some life lessons you learned from your military experience?
Well, I think one of the major things I learned, even when I first went in, was, I don't know that I'm using it as much nowadays as I should have, but one thing I learned the most was keep my mouth shut, but was taking orders and doing what people told you to do. That wasn't unusual for me because even from the time I was born till I went into the Army, I was only taught one word. I was taught discipline. Everything about me was discipline. And a lot of times, if I talked too much, it got me in trouble because some people take discipline as being a bit too arrogant. And the more you tell them how tough you are, the harder they make it on you. I found that out the hard way. But when I went into the Army, the first thing they told me was, you want to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you'll be going to bed at 10 o'clock at night. Well, that's good advice, but my dad always told me, he said, son, you get up an hour earlier than everybody else and go to bed an hour later. You'll have plenty enough time for sleeping in the grave. So naturally, my mouth got me in trouble when they said, you're going to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I appreciate the extra hour because I'm used to getting up at 4. And, of course, if you tell them how tough you are, that's how tough you're going to have to prove that you are. And many times, whenever, it paid off in the long run, though, because, like I told you earlier, most of these people were drafted. And since I was not drafted and I had volunteered, the main thing I got was, you deserve this, you got it coming, you asked for it. And I said, well, when the chaplain goes over the hill, I'll be right behind him. But I won't be the first one out, I'll be the first one there. And I've always tried to live up to my expectations, and it's always paid off for me, at least I think it has. Because there were a lot of times when I was doing certain things that later on in life paid off for me, because while I was volunteering and doing these things, someone would come up and say, can you do this? Can you do that? Would you do this? Would you do that? And yes, I've done it before. Sometimes when you get older, they say, have you done anything? You say, well, you've done a little bit of everything. You may not be a master at all of it, but at least you know a little bit about it, and it'll get you by. But one of the things that I learned when I was in the Army was when they ask you a question or tell you to do something, you just answer the question, and you do what you're told, and you'll always come out ahead. I even had a captain that was in charge of our unit actually called me into his office, and I reported to him. And we had an inspection, and I figured I was going to get chewed out because you normally didn't report to a commander in those days without you were ready. You'd done something wrong, and they were ready to punish you for it, because we did get a lot of punishing in those days. And the first thing he said to me was, you get a 3-day pass for being a good soldier, and they gave me 3 days leave. And I couldn't understand why. And he says, I've been in the Army a long time. I've never had a soldier that was more perfect than you are. Best compliment I'd ever received in my life. And a lot of times I receive compliments like that due to the fact that it didn't matter who the individual was, what their rank was. It didn't matter where they came from or anything about them. My dad always taught me one thing, even from the time I was able to talk, and I wasn't even in school at 5 and 6 years old. He said, son, all of you are equal, and it doesn't matter what kind of clothes that man's got on. He's still a man, just like you are. Don't ever have anyone look down on you. Always be a man. So that was 2 of the lessons that I learned from my dad. And there was a couple that I learned from my mother, but the one thing I learned from my dad was he said, son, do the best you can. And one problem I have with that is no matter how good I ever did, I never did know when I was doing my best, but I always tried to do the best that I could because my dad told me that that's what I was supposed to do. And when he said, be a man, do you become a man when you're 17 or when you're 21 or when you do a good job? When do you become a man? I never did really know. All I knew was I was going to do the best I could. And my mother would say to me, she'd say, there are 2 roads. Take the right one. You see someone else taking the wrong road, go the other way. And whatever bed that you make for yourself in life, whether it be hard or whether it be soft, you're the one that's going to have to sleep in it. Always remember that. I've always remembered that, and I think it's probably got me through those efforts better than anything else.
What message would you like to leave for future generations who will view this interview?
I think basically when our future generations, based on everything I've said up to this point, that the one thing that the future generations, I hope, learn is the same thing that I was taught, was to always be positive about everything, always do the best that you can do, always discipline yourself, and if everyone is disciplined and everyone does the right thing, you'll always go in the right direction. If you don't do what you're told to do, and what you're told to do is right, and you do the opposite, there's only one road that you'll go, and it'll be the wrong one. The future generations that I would be discussing, I would hope, would be following in the same footsteps that my mother and dad taught me to follow. And the one thing I think that might be a problem with this nation, maybe it's been brought on by our leaders, our politicians, or whoever, and I know that it was a sad day when someone says, we no longer have a draft. Well, I got to where I am because I was avoiding the draft, and of course I was looking forward to going into the military. Whether I would be drafted or whether that was just the direction I was going, the one thing that everyone should take into consideration is discipline, to always do the right thing and set your sights on what you want to be and what you want to become. I knew early on that what I wanted to be with my entire life was an inspector. And I've spent my entire life as an inspector. And of course, no one calls them inspectors anymore. What they are is they're quality assurance people. There's not a job in this nation that doesn't require quality. And out of all the people that I have ever studied and read about, and of all the people that have put quality first in all their organizations, and I have found that there's not one place in this country that you can't find an occupation doing nothing but making sure that everything is done right. And that's what I based my entire life on trying to see that was accomplished, was do it right. Because if you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it over? And so when I set my sights on becoming an inspector, that's what I ended up being.